Hey everyone, this is Nitro. So, now that chapter 50 of Langrisser Mobile's story is in place, we are now able to get this item, the Stone of Dreams, which allows you to reset Matthew's class path. So with this item, I thought I would talk about the way to build Matthew, and specifically it will be about the way to build Matthew depending on the class path you have access to. It's important to note that with this Stone of Dream items, you're just resetting Matthew's second class path. So one class path of Matthew, no matter what, will always be Swordsman to Hero line. But the other class path, will be changed depending on the answers you select, and even the side branch will change a bit. So, with that said, this video, I will have it first laid out so that I'll talk about Matthew in general, things that are shared between all the class paths, and then talk about each class path specifically. So I'll have a table of contents in the video description, so if you want to just jump to a certain class path, you can, or if you want to get the full overview of all 4 class paths, you can do that as well. Now, before I start, I should mention that you have to pick certain answers to get access to these class paths of Matthew, right? And I will have a link in the video description as well to the Langrisser page, which tells you the answers to reach certain classes. So if you want to refer to that link so you can select a specific class path for Matthew, just use that link, basically. So with that said, Matthew's second class can be one of the following 4 choices, which are Archer, which is the one I have, Assassin, Cavalry, and Flyer. In brief, Flyer is generally considered to be the most viable for PvP, while Cavalry is considered the second most viable in terms of the meta. And then finally, Archer and Assassin are the least meta options for PvP, but they're actually quite good for PvP, specifically for the Hugin and Munin battle. So, before I cover each class though, I am going to talk about the parts of Matthew which applies globally, regardless of his class. So, first things first, I should also mention that in terms of equipment, Matthew will likely not have his own custom set of gear built. Instead, he will be sharing the gear with another character you have, depending on the class he is in. For example, if your Matthew is in an Archer class, I generally just share my gear with either taking gear from Omega or Zerina, right? If your Matthew is in his Flyer class, you probably will share gear with either Shuri or Alte Muller, because you're not likely to have both Shuri and Alte Muller and Matthew in your Apex box, for example, or in the battle. So Matthew will not have his own set of gear in general. He's just sharing it with someone else. And because of this, I should mention his enchant will most likely be Breeze as a result, right? Because Breeze is usually used for PvP. The mobility buff that Breeze can provide can win you matches in PvP. And while Matthew's arguably best enchant for PvE content will likely be Full Moon, for the 15% increased attack value, so that he can benefit from that via his bonds of friendship, attack command, and so on. You're not going to build a set of gear just for that. It's going to require way too much gold to be worth the cost. Alright, so with that mentioned, let's talk about his talent first, which is actually completely wrong at 6 stars. I have to mention that. Here, it says that there is a 100% chance to trigger a 20% defense increase. But what it's not mentioning is that it actually increases attack as well as defense, right? So when entering battle, if there is an ally within 3 blocks, there is a 100% chance to trigger I guess it should be 20% attack and defense increase. My confusion is it might actually just be 15% attack and defense increase. I'm not sure if it's 15 or 20%, but just so you know, that is in effect. Second, because this boost triggers an attack and defense increase, it will affect his soldiers, because soldiers are attack based. So, the fact that his talent boosts his soldiers, and the fact that his hero boost is quite offensively oriented, with a 35% attack increase here. It makes Matthew a surprisingly good character at attacking in general and one-shotting enemies. Now, one other thing I should mention is, globally speaking, Matthew, in terms of accessory, he wants an accessory that increases attack value. So he does have an exclusive accessory where the exclusive will provide a 10% attack, defense, and magic defense increase as long as an ally is within 2 blocks. So it's a very nice accessory to have. But other than that accessory, very viable for Matthew in fact, are other accessories like Overlord's Badge, Slayer's Emblem, and so on. Really, you just want an accessory that provides plus attack, right? Plus 75 attack, plus attack percentage, and then an enchant with plus 10% attack, preferably. So, even so, whether it's Slayer's Emblem, whether it's Winged Shin Guards, whether it's an Overlord's Badge, it's kind of up to you. It is important to note though, Overlord's Badge, with that attack and int immunity, the attack and int reduction immunity effect is very, very useful. Okay, so with the accessory covered, and the accessory choice is pretty much global, regardless of class, I should mention the other things that are shared globally, which is the soldiers he has access to from the training ground. Because he has so many classes, Matthew actually ends up getting 6 different soldiers from the training ground, which are Highland Warriors, Angels, Shinobi, Firebrand Snipers, Hellhounds, and finally Goblin Knights, or Earth Elf Knights, as they call them. Right. A whole bunch of soldiers. Not every single one will be useful in truth, but it is what it is. So, with all these global things covered, I should also mention actually his Heart Bond effect. Right? So, Matthew's Heart Bond is actually very, very good. At level 4, it provides the following effect. When hero's class is hero, when this unit has over 5 buffs, damage taken is decreased by 10% after entering battle. As for when hero's class is any advanced class but hero, when attacking, unit's damage taken is decreased by 10%. Right? The level 7 one is pretty much the same, except offensively oriented. So when class is hero and it has 5 buffs, damage dealt is increased by 10% after entering battle. And that's whether you're being attacked or attacking. As for when hero's class is any advanced class but hero, when attacking and entering battle, damage dealt is increased by 10%. And then of course the level 10 effect is all stats plus 5%. So it's a very, very good Heart Bond effects. All 3 are very useful. But you can see that my personal Heart Bond is at level 4, and I actually have no real interest in raising it any further. Or I should say, I do have interest in raising it further, but I don't want to commit the resources into leveling it any further at this time. There's too many new heroes coming up that I have to build, and I'd rather save the materials for those heroes rather than upgrade Matthew at this time. Remember, I've used Matthew without the Heart Bond maxed out for Eternal Temple, for Hugin and Munin, and I've cleared them and gotten S rank in those. So the Heart Bond is very much a nice to have, upgraded, but not required upgrade. Alright, so with all that covered, let's move on to talk about Matthew's classes. And the first class will be the one that I have access to, the Archer Matthew. Archer Matthew's primary use is for PvE content, and specifically for the Hugin and Munin battle. I should mention as well, I used my Archer Matthew for my Eternal Temple Scylla level 65 fights, but basically endgame content is where Archer Matthew can shine. It is important to note though, you do not need an Archer Matthew to S rank Hugin and Munin. It makes it easier, especially because Matthew can provide attack command boosting the damage that Narm can do by 10%, right? The 10% attack increase. But once again, not required. People who just use Narm as their primary and sole damage dealer in Hugin and Munin can clear it just fine as well, and get S rank successfully. So, nonetheless, it certainly made my personal life easier for getting my Hugin and Munin clear. In terms of skills from the Archer Matthew class, well, I get Snipe, I get Roundabout, and Deathmatch. And then there is also Assault from the Branch skill. For Hugin and Munin specifically, the skill combo that I personally use is what you see right here. There will be Attack Command to boost everyone's attack. There will be Roundabout, because Roundabout provides 10% increased damage, and every other turn, Matthew can attack and retreat. This actually did come into play several times in my clear. You know, it basically allowed me to be more forgiving for mistakes I've made in positioning. And finally, the final skill is actually preferably Deathmatch, because Deathmatch increases your attack and skill by 12%. So that's a big boost in attack, especially when your characters already get like 100% attack increase in the battle. This is a better combo, in truth, than bringing an attack skill like Air Slash or Snipe, because these skills have a 2-turn cooldown, so you can only use it once every 3 turns, whereas the 12% attack increase is consistent. The only thing that you might consider removing and changing up would be removing Roundabout for one of these attack skills, but it's a choice between 10% damage or 1.5 times damage. It's overall a pretty minor difference, right? Now, the other thing to mention as well is Snipe only actually does 1.4 times damage, whereas Air Slash, Matthew's basic skill, does 1.5 times. So in truth, Snipe is really kind of like a rather useless skill overall. Other than this, my Matthew, when I use it, occasionally I would just replace the Deathmatch skill with the Protagonist Faction buff, but that's really the only change I would make. Otherwise, generally speaking, he always brings Attack Command, he always brings Roundabout. You know, Deathmatch is the one that I swap in and out. In terms of soldiers, right? Well, generally speaking, it depends on which soldier you have leveled up, but arguably the best one for Matthew would be Dark Elf Snipers, because he's likely to be the character to attack targets at 100% hit points, right? And in that case, the Dark Elf Snipers, they actually do additional damage. At level 10, I think it's a 45% attack and defense increase. My Dark Elf Snipers are not at level 10. So, other than that, you know, Shinobi do fixed damage and have a crit hit increase rate, which isn't that great. Firebrand Snipers do have the attack increase of 18%, which is less than the Dark Elf Snipers, but they also do fixed damage after the battle. So, overall, I would say Dark Elf Snipers is the best, followed by the other choices. And that's, at least that's for the Archer Matthew. So, other than Archer Matthew, Archer Matthew, in terms of gear, I should talk about that. The gear for Archer Matthew is really, you just take gear from Zerda or Omega. Right? You just want any bow that provides a 107 attack increase with a 10% attack increase. Right? It could be an Extreme Magic Bow, but realistically, Extreme Magic Bow would never really kick in for Matthew, because Matthew has no mobility increase. So he's stuck at 3 mobility. Right? Thus, the chances of him being able to get into melee attack range to strike someone is minuscule. For the armor, he definitely wants Last Rites, like any other archer and assassin and flyer. For the helmet, he definitely wants King's Crown, especially since this Matthew has Roundabout to attack and retreat, so he has a pretty good chance of applying the 20% extra damage on an ally. As for the accessory, well, I already talked about the accessory choice, so I won't mention that again. And then we move on to the Assassin Matthew. Assassin Matthew, gear-wise, is the exact same as Archer Matthew, because they share the same gear set. Okay. What Assassin Matthew has, though, is he's actually very, very viable for Hugin and Munin as well. And he's very underrated for it, in fact, because Assassin Matthew has the Ninjitsu skill. So, what Ninjitsu does, it's a skill that Sonya and Joshua both have. It provides, basically, first, all passable terrains are treated as planes. And if the terrain increases defense, attack increases by the same value. In other words, if Matthew is on a forest tile, he gets 20% attack increase. If he's on a city wall tile, he gets 30% attack increase. This is an incredibly high attack increase just for a 1-point skill. So Assassin Matthew is very, very viable for the Hugin and Munin battle. Very, very underrated for it, in fact, is what I would say. Yeah. Assassin Matthew can effectively get more attack than Archer Matthew does. The drawback, of course, is Assassin Matthew does not get Roundabout. But at the same time, Roundabout is not a required skill. So, for Hugin and Munin, Assassin Matthew will probably bring Attack Command. He will bring Ninjitsu as the 1-point skill. And then the final skill will be Air Slash for a 1.5 times attack skill. So, with the 2 ranged class Matthews covered, which are really used for Eternal Temple and Hugin and Munin, let's move on to talk about the other 2 classes, and we'll start with the Flyer class. So, Flyer class Matthew is really considered the most meta Matthew because it has use in both PvP and PvE. Right? The Flyer class Matthew, the 2 most useful skills it gets access to are Gale and Sprint. Okay. Sprint is the skill that is on Leticia. Right? It has a 3 span with 3 turn cooldown, and mobility of all friendly units is increased by 1. Attack and int are both increased by 20%, and it grants an immunity to mobility reduction effects that silence passive skills. Grants immunity to mobility reduction and effects that silence active skills, lasting 2 turns. It's important to note that Matthew does not have the love support skill that Leticia does, and Leticia's love support is what provides an additional 1 mobility. So whereas Leticia provides 2 mobility for everybody, Matthew just provides 1. And Matthew, so something to just keep in mind. Nonetheless, that 1 mobility can often be very useful and critical for clearing certain maps in time, right? Especially time rift battles, which have a certain turn limit. And Gale, of course, is the skill that is on Luna and Alte Muller. What Gale does is it's a passive where after taking action, you have a 20% chance to act again. So, the act again effect can win you matches in PvP for sure, right? For example, let's say Matthew moves forward and launches an air slash at the enemy, at 2 range. If Gale activates, he can launch a second attack, which will guarantee a kill for sure. So it's a very, very nice 1-point skill to have for PvP. And so, because of this, Flyer Matthew's skill combo is usually what I just said, right? You bring Air Slash, you bring Gale. For the final 2-point skill, you choose between Sprint or the faction buff that Matthew has. Depends on your party, of course, right? And that would be Flyer Matthew. So, in terms of soldier choices, Flyer Matthew from the Flyer class actually gets access to Griffin Knights, so he usually chooses between using Angels and Griffin Knights for his soldiers. Angels, of course, offer the... Let me just go back. Angels offer the 20% attack and defense increase, while also having the magic damage decrease of 45%, while Griffin Knights, they actually offer more attack and defense increase. Griffin Knights actually offer a 30% attack and defense increase at level 10. So if you have them both leveled up, you may swap between the 2 depending on what you face. Lots of mages, you probably want Angels. Maximum damage, you want Griffin Knights. And in terms of gear that Matthew prefers, well, it's pretty much the exact same gear you want on Cherie or Alte Muller. Right? For the weapon, you definitely want a Ragnarok, right? For the fixed damage before battle begins. For the armor, Last Rites, right? For the helmet, King's Crown is a solid choice, and then the accessory doesn't change as usual. So with that, that is 3 classes covered. And now we move on to talk about the 4th and final class, which is the Cavalry Matthew. In the Cavalry class, Matthew gets access to Strike and Move Again, and both of these skills are actually on the Heart Stone. So, Strike is a skill where when you activate it, your attack is increased by 20% for 1 turn, and you can move another 3 blocks and attack. So you can think of Strike as being a weaker version of Leon's Chivalry, right? Doesn't provide damage reduction, doesn't provide 30% attack, just the 20%, and so on. It doesn't provide reinforcements. Nonetheless, for Matthew, Strike is incredibly useful, especially since he has Air Slash to attack at 2 range, so he doesn't necessarily need the healing or the damage reduction, since Air Slash lets him strike at 2 range. As for Move Again, well, Move Again needs no introduction. It simply allows you to have increased damage by 10%, and if remaining mobility is not 0, you can move again after attacking, so you can attack and retreat. Cavalry Matthew is actually more commonly used in his infantry class than in his actual cavalry class, right? Because an infantry Matthew who can have Strike, who can have Air Slash, who can have Move Again, has incredible utility, right? It's an infantry with extreme range who can attack and retreat, which is really, really good. And in addition to that, if you do have a pair of Apex boots to give to Matthew, he can have 4 base mobility rather than 3. So it's just a combination of factors which makes a Strike version of Infantry Matthew very viable if you made him in his cavalry class, right? In this kind of scenario, for soldiers, Matthew would usually bring either Angels from the training ground, Heavy Infantry, because Heavy Infantry have the most attack increase out of the infantry options he has access to. I should preface this by saying that if, for example, you have Highland Warriors at level 10 due to having leveled them for Leonhard, you probably won't level up Heavy Infantry just for Matthew, right? You'll just use the Highland Warriors instead. Or if you don't have Heavy Infantry leveled up, you'll probably just use the Angels. And finally, he also gets access to Vampire Bats from his Cavalry class. So basically, make use of what soldiers you have. He has 2 flyer options, Angels and Vampire Bats, and he has 2 infantry options, right? Highland Warriors or Heavy Phalanx. So take your pick. And in terms of gear for Infantry Matthew, well, his ideal set of gear is basically the exact same as Leon, right? You want maximum attack value, so you want a Seal Guardian as the weapon with 107 attack increase. For the armor, it can really be any armor, right? In the first place, Matthew is not really expected to take attacks because he should be protected by his tank, so the armor is not a huge deal. As long as it's an SSR providing a good amount of stat increases, you're good to go. In terms of the helmet, Vampire Mask would generally be best because you bring Strike, right? So with Strike, you can trigger the Vampire Mask debuff. And finally, with regards to the accessory, same as before, his exclusive, Old Lord's Badge, Slayer's Emblem, Winged Shin Guards, yada yada yada. Interesting thing to note as well though, for the Matthew in PvP, it may be worth considering replacing the Vampire Mask in favor of bringing a Chief's Helmet. Because the Chief's Helmet can provide an adjacent ally the immunity to effects that prevent them from being healed for 1 turn. So that buff can save you against, let's say Sword Dance, or unlikely as it may be, Sword Soul from Elwyn, right? It's not that likely to save you from Elwyn because Elwyn's Sword Soul does remove 5 buffs beforehand, right? But if that buff manages to stay on the character who was applied the Chief's Helmet effect, then they can be healed right away. And certainly it will be, if nothing else, another buff for Elwyn's Sword Soul to remove. So there you have it. All 4 classes of Matthew and the way to really build them in general, right? So with that, thanks for watching everyone. I hope you found this video useful. And on that note, Nitro out.